Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our excerpts for this program are from previous programs we recorded with guests who have attained a certain degree of fame and notoriety during the past year. These included Ann Stoller, who now teaches at the New School in New York, Marina Whitman, an economist who lives here in Ann Arbor, and former Governor of Michigan, Jennifer Granholm, who has a program on current TV called War Room.
My guest today is Ann Laura Stoller, the author of Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, Race and the Intimate in Colonial Rule. Welcome to Rip Rap, Ann.
Thank you, Jim.
I noticed that for an author whose book focuses so closely on intimate relationships, it was interesting how you acknowledge the impact and support of family and friends, even dedicating it to your mother, sister, and a friend.
This is a book that I would have dedicated to them, sort of no matter what the subject was. All of them had died within 5 years of one another. And all of them were sort of an inspiration in different sorts of ways. Political inspiration, my dearest, oldest friend, Joanne. Sort of aesthetic, literary inspiration, my sister. And a sort of emotional intensity of my mother. But they would have been there in any case because they were so forceful and sort of present in my life while I was writing this.
I thought it was interesting because it evoked that whole issue of intimacy and relationships and how people influence each other across that in those ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
As we begin a more detailed discussion of this book, Carnal Knowledge and Imperial Power, and its study of Dutch colonialism in the Javanese heartland of colonial Indonesia and in the Delhi of northern Sumatra, perhaps you'd explain why you embarked on this project, how you formed your strategies for research, what archives did you find helpful, and why did you decide to use colonial photographs as a visual counterpoint to textual discourses and practices analyzed?
Well, that question alone could take me hours to answer. In a way, this is a strange book because I didn't ever really mean to embark upon it. It was not something I said, I'm going to write a book now. I had started, I should probably start back where it emerged from and its genealogy. I had done my dissertation work in Sumatra and I was working on a labor history of multinationals. And I was just incredibly impressed with the extent to which issues around labor strategies, labor management, were over and over again about the intimate. We're over and over again about controlling those people who worked on those estates who were Javanese, but those people who were also the European employers on them. And it struck me, sort of a child of 68, a Vietnam War baby, someone who was honed on Marxism and feminism, that so much of what we did as scholars was study history from the bottom up. I mean, that was de rigueur. That was what you did. That was what you were supposed to do. And for my generation, we almost avoided looking at history from the top down. It was sort of not cool to be doing. It was not what you did. And it seemed very strange. There was some dissonance there. If we were so concerned with questions of power, of capitalism, of empire, of colonialism, why is it that we could only study those who are being oppressed by it in some ways, and also assume that the only people being oppressed by it were those who were colonized? But the other sort of aspect of this, which was sort of very poignant for me, is how much anthropology at the moment that I was writing imagined that the study of colonialism was only the study of the colonized. That if you did an ethnography, what you did an ethnography of was of only part of the people that were in that equation. And that led me not only to want to understand more of who these colonials were, but how the very categories themselves emerged. I mean, how do we know who was colonized or uncolonized? How did those very constructions themselves come about? As I said, I felt really constrained by the rubrics of what ethnography was supposed to be. And therefore, I got even more interested in what were the politics of the way ethnography was supposed to come out. Why is it that everyone who could have possibly been at those scenes of these intense labor relations, these forms of violence, that a large part of those people were siphoned out of the picture? I guess another way to sort of speak about that genealogy is that there were really two kinds of statements that influenced me as a young scholar, but continue to intrigue me now, and that I still don't know if I know how to answer, or even that I'm always working in some sense to approach. And one of those, the most powerful, the one that sort of sustains me to this day, is the notion that, and it's the most banal of all, is that the personal is political. I mean, it's such an easy sort of epigram of feminism of the 1970s. But to actually theorize what that could mean, what does it mean to say the personal is always political? How does that work out? What is it about the personal when we say it's political? Is that the personal is constructed by politics? Is that people's intimate lives are always political in some sense? I mean, how do you take that apart? The other one was coming from a really strong Marxist tradition, that people make their own history, but not exactly as they please. Another kind of statement that, from my generation, we all know, we all sort of subscribe to. But to think what that actually meant, what are the spaces of agency that are possible? What are the ways in which people are constructed by the environments in which they live? And particularly, with the kind of work I was doing in the archives, by the categories in which they live. I became fascinated, totally intrigued by categories, by why the colonial state was so concerned and obsessed with categories, and why it was so obsessed with sex over and over again. Subjects that seem not to be the subjects that were the political, returned not as my interest as a feminist or as a Marxist, but dead center in the archives themselves. So in a sense, the lead that I've taken over the last 15 years is not from theory, but it's from the archives themselves, is really from the texture of those archives. And I sort of often say that sort of what interests me is working in some sense along the grain of the archive, rather than in that way that Walter Benjamin has taught us we should always be working against the grain of the archive and coming up with that other story. Well, it's hard to come up with the other story unless you know what that dominant story is.
Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Harley, and we're going to talk about her book, The Outsourced Self, Intimate Life in Market Times, and we're going to define what outsourced is.
Outsourcing is when you're paying someone to do something that, let's say 30 years ago, you didn't pay somebody to do. If, for example, a young person was looking for a partner 30 years ago, there would be church socials, there would be after-school meetups, there would be family or friend dinners where you might meet somebody. Today, it's more likely that someone would put down some money and join Match.com. In fact, for a in the first chapter of The Outsourced Self, I described the story of a 49-year-old woman who was divorced, had a 12-year-old, and was lonely. And 30 years ago, she wouldn't have outsourced this task of finding someone, but she said, look, you know what, time is getting on, and I'm going to bite the bullet and do this. And so the story gets to the heart of the matter in The Outsourced Self, because it's of a very nice love coach and a very efficient service and a very nice person using it. So we're not talking about any issue with the people involved. But what happens is that in the course of doing this, she's introduced to a way of thinking about herself and a way of thinking about others that is market-like, and she is called to draw a line between herself and that market way of thinking. So this is a perfect storm. There are new needs, new social class out there that has these needs, new social anxiety, about those needs. And there's an elimination of alternatives to the market. We don't live with public services. There's a great denigration of anything the government does. So we don't get to live as much of Europe does with paid parental leave, for example, with shorter hours of work, with great public preschool and schooling. So we can't turn to the public sector, and we can't turn to the old-time community either. So the alternatives to the market are disappearing, and the market is growing. And there's one third factor that makes this the perfect storm. We're living over the last 3 decades in a political climate that heroizes the market, denigrates anything else. And we've seen the privatization of prisons, of schools, now of parks and libraries. So there's a kind of a move to put much of the public realm, civic realm, into the market. And this looks to me like one step more. Well, let's put private life into the for-profit sector
But it
too.
seems like there's a
Perfect storm.
Yeah, there's a confluence of factors. One of them, as you said, is the loss of the village life, the community, the neighborhood. And so people have real needs that aren't being met. Need for community, of sharing, of someone to help them deal with the different questions that they have in their life.
Yes.
And that seems a real loss.
Yes. I just learned about a new service called Social Susan, which helps you find friends online for a price if you're, say, new to an area. And at first I thought, well, terrific. This is a new way of finding friends, of getting the community we lack. Then I began to think twice, because on the one hand, if you walk down the street, everyone's on their cell phone and not looking at you. If you stop to sit in a park, everyone's on their cell phone and not looking at you. If you go to a restaurant, everyone's on the cell phone and not looking at you. So it's really hard to make friends if you're looking to make friends, because even that very first act of looking you in the eye or saying hello or nice day has disappeared. So there's a kind of almost a unconscious, no one person's responsible for it, disappearance of that first act of making friends from the public realm. So that's a kind of a takeaway. And then there's a kind of a give back. Now you can pay for a service that through the internet will get you a local friend. But there's a new language in that service. It said, an efficient way to find a friend, good ROI in finding a friend. And then it also says that you want to be put in the company with people who are really committed to finding a friend. And what's the emblem of commitment? That they've paid. That means they really want a friend, is because they've paid. Then they must be motivated to find a friend. Well, is that the sign we want of commitment in a desire to find a friend? I think it's more a social class filter. And finally, they say it's very good to sign up to our service, because if you want to sell something and you're looking to market a product, well, what better way to find friends? So you would be put in the company of people that are trying to sell you something, and maybe just sell to each other. Who knows who joins this thing? It's all new. And in a way, that's what the outsourced self is doing. It's looking at what can become a big trend. It hasn't hit everybody. I mean, Facebook, for example, it's 11% of the world's population are on Facebook. And that's not everyone, but hey, short 10 years ago, nobody was on it. So I'm just trying to give in this book a heads up where I think the social trends are aligned such that they're pointing us in this direction. And you could say, well, this only hits the affluent, and you'd be right mainly. Although poor people eat out, for example, as often as rich people do, but they eat out at different cheaper places. But this is just as important for poor people as it is for rich, because if we're all moving into an everything for sale world, and if market culture comes with many of these for sale services, poor people are doubly out. For the outsourced self, I did a survey of California residents, and I compared rich to poor, and I discovered two things. One is that poor people want these services more than rich people do.
I thought that was very...
What a paradox, that the people that can't afford it are the ones that want it the most, and the ones who can afford it want it less. And the reason for that is that poor people have less community, helpful community, than rich people do. I asked one question: do you agree or disagree with this statement, that you can't always count on family and friends, but you can always count on money to get what you want or get what you need? And poor people were far more likely to answer yes, that's true, than were rich people. So if we're moving into an everything for sale world, public services, and now even private life outside of the market, you're really hitting poor people doubly. You're taking their social citizenship away from them because they can't fall back on community, helpful community, in the way that middle class people can.
Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guests today are Jennifer Granholm and Dan Mulhern. Today we'll be talking about their book, A Governor's Story, which discusses the economic challenges that occurred while Jennifer Granholm was Michigan's top political executive. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
As we were talking before the program, I think this is a really well-written book.
Well, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Coming from you, that means a lot.
Yeah.
A connoisseur of all good writing.
Yeah. But what's interesting, you took the genre of autobiography and then you made it a serious reflection. And maybe you want to talk about why you did that and how you did it.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, it's co-authored. It's in my voice because it is a governor's story, but Dan really, who is a very thoughtful person, brought out a lot of the more personal aspects of running a state during a time of crisis that probably are more interesting to people. My tendency would not be to do that. My tendency would be to go right to the policy and, go like that. But Dan, I think, made the book much more interesting. The reason why we wrote this is because every day we open the papers and we see what the president is going through and what the country's going through. And we think, we have been there. This is exactly what Michigan experienced through the first decade of this century. And I think that Michigan's story is illustrative for the country. It has a lesson for the nation in terms of what we learned, what we did, and what we didn't do, and what worked and what didn't work.
It was fascinating to see. You had great detail, which I always enjoyed. But to see the people who are going through the crisis. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's one thing to talk about possible GM bankruptcy in the abstract form or in terms of news and newspaper magazine articles. It's something else with a person who has the responsibility to try to not make that happen.
For sure. I mean, the personal stories of Michigan citizens, it's why this book is really on sort of three levels. There's the personal level of Dan and I, and then there's the level of what Michigan citizens were really experiencing on the ground. And then there's a level of Michigan being the canary in the coal mine for the nation.
One of the fads of the hour in the management field was MBWA, management by walking around. And a governor walks around a lot. So whether it's plant floors or state parks or wherever, you saw a lot of people. And it wasn't uncommon, Jim, to sometimes when Jen was with family and sometimes by herself, to have the kind of one-on-one encounters, a few of which are in the book, that really brought this book to life, brought Jennifer's political struggles and the economic struggles to life in really profoundly human ways, and hopefully that comes alive in the book.
Well, and that's what makes the book really interesting. It's not abstract statistics and stories about generalities. There are specific people mentioned, you know, in specific towns like Greenville and what it's gone through. And then your different, you know, experiences with that. And it turns the whole notion of an autobiography kind of on its head. It's not a self-indulgent narrative of what I want to do and my disappointments or victories. It's really a larger frame kind of situation.
Well, Jennifer couldn't claim victory on the one hand, and you know, didn't want to shift blame, really. I mean, this is a book about people's genuine struggles, because people in Michigan had to and have to reinvent themselves. But in a way, it's also a story of Jennifer's and to some degree my reinvention too, that we were just regular people in a really, really difficult circumstance. And so, you know, I think she did a great job of not telling platitudes or trying to write some legacy that the journalists are always worried about, what's your legacy, but instead to give people a sense of the personal drama and also, of course, the bigger political and economic issues that Michigan
really
is grappling with.
It, just to be really candid about.
Well, I thought it was frankly really courageous, and that you talked about what Frank Kelly told you about do what's supposed to be done and let the rest of it sort itself out. And I think that sorting itself out part, the legacy is still coming out. You know, I don't think people still quite understand what the thing was. But what always bothered me during your governorship was the thing of the little present that John Engler left behind that nobody knew about, the $2 billion package. You know, when you come into office and you think it's one set of circumstances and you arrive and find out it's something much different, the state doesn't have $2 billion in some account that can just wash that all away.
We wished we did, but no, it was a gift that kept on giving, and you know, and then compounded, of course, by globalization and the experience of losing all of these manufacturing jobs, and you know what the auto suppliers were feeling. They were just reeling from all of this, and then it all culminates in 2008 when you know the auto industry goes bankrupt. So it was. But all of that being said, there is a hopeful end. In Chapter 10, we put some very specific recommendations that we think are important for the nation.
Themes throughout this is the whole glass ceiling thing and women excelling.
I guess, of course, while I was doing it, first of all, the term glass ceiling hadn't been invented. Lynn Martin invented that when she was Secretary of Labor. And I wasn't really aware that that's what I was doing. I just knew that there were certain things I wanted to do, and I felt I was capable of doing them, and I just worked to push aside the barriers, always with a smile. My husband says I'm wonderful at using my sharp elbows, but with a smile on my face, and that got me a long way.
Well, you had all kinds of situations, even the I think, who was it that said that they couldn't accept you as a PhD student because
they didn't have enough ladies' rooms. That was the president of Princeton, I hate to say it, in 1958. And the economics department, had invited me to be a student there, and my husband was teaching at Princeton, so it seemed pretty logical. But the department said, you know, Marina, there's one little barrier, you're going to have to go talk to the president. So I went and had this conversation with the president, and at one point he did actually say, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitman, we can't accept a student of your high caliber, but first he said, we don't have housing for women students. And I said, well, that's all right, because I'm living in the leftover World War II barracks with my husband, who's an instructor here. And so that stopped him for a minute, and then finally he got down to the ladies' room. And so I got on a train and went to Columbia and got a PhD. And many years later, Bill Bowen had asked me to be on the Board of Trustees of Princeton, which I did for 10 years. And Bill wanted me to go out to Meadow Lakes, which was the retirement home in which that former president was now living. And he really wanted me to engage him in the mistake he'd made. And I said, Bill, I'm not going to go out and bug some 90-year-old about the fact that 30 years ago he wouldn't let me go to Princeton. So that encounter never took place.
There's other stories that you have that by virtue of being so heavily involved with some of these things, I mean, you were involved with Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. I mean, there was an insider viewpoint that I found really interesting.
No, there's no question that I did get to see some aspects of these people's personalities that were not necessarily visible to the public. I remember once running into Kissinger and the president's box at the Kennedy Center, and our son, who was maybe 12 or 13, was with us that night. And he treated our son to the most incredible discussion of world events and his view of them. But the most amazing one was actually a breakfast that the three members of the Council of Economic Advisors and their spouses had with the Nixons one morning in the so-called family dining room. And it was ostensibly to say goodbye to one of the members who was going back to Stanford. And the president, about halfway through this breakfast, started the most impressive discussion. Well, I don't know, is it a discussion? I guess it was a monologue, not a discussion, about geopolitics and America's role in the world as a balancer keeping the peace, and his role in making sure that America did that. And it was brilliant and fascinating. And suddenly he turns to my husband, the English professor, and says, but of course, Professor Whitman, because you deal with students, you know that you can't tell people the truth about why you're doing things. You have to give them a story which will make them support you. And suddenly, there before our eyes, Dr. Jekyll turned into Mr. Hyde. And the president himself had no idea that the shift had taken place, or that what he'd said was in any way an insight, and not a positive insight, into his character. And it was, I never actually discussed that with my two colleagues on the council, but it was certainly burned into my memory.